Lisa Evans stepped out of her sleek, polished black car, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the cobblestone pavement outside Le Bistro, her favorite high-end restaurant. The winter air was brisk, carrying with it a biting chill that contrasted with the warmth radiating from the dimly lit windows of the restaurant. She adjusted her coat, a tailored cashmere piece that exuded the sophistication and refinement she was known for in the city's elite circles. Everything about Lisa's appearance, from her perfectly styled hair to the diamond glint on her wrist, reflected a life built on control, precision, and unyielding ambition. As she walked toward the entrance, her gaze swept over her surroundings with practiced indifference. But then, she noticed something that disrupted her otherwise flawless evening. A man sitting on the pavement a few steps from the door. He was huddled in a worn, oversized jacket, his face hidden beneath the shadows of a battered beanie. His presence was an intrusion, a reminder of a world she had deliberately distanced herself from. The man shifted slightly, lifting his head as if sensing her gaze. His face was rugged, lined with the unmistakable marks of hardship and time. His eyes, tired but strangely resilient, met hers, and Lisa felt a flicker of discomfort, a twinge that she hadn't felt in years. She quickly averted her eyes, but in that fleeting moment, she caught the subtle curve of his mouth, a small, hopeful smile that seemed out of place on a face marked by so much loss. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his voice hoarse yet carrying a quiet dignity. "Could you spare some food, please?" Lisa froze, the simple request reverberating in her mind, stirring a cascade of emotions she immediately repressed. Compassion, she had learned, was a luxury she couldn't afford in her world. She had spent years perfecting her armor, hardening herself against vulnerabilities, against anything or anyone that might divert her from her goals. She looked at him fully now, her expression carefully blank. Yet, in her mind, she dissected the scene with cold rationality. This man represented everything she had left behind, everything she had fought so ruthlessly to overcome. To her, he was a cautionary tale, a visual reminder of choices and consequences. Her silence must have conveyed her answer, but the man held her gaze, unyielding. His eyes were filled with a quiet plea, not so much for food, but for acknowledgement, for someone to look beyond the dirt and wear and see the person he once was. But Lisa would not be that person. She prided herself on her discipline, her resolve, her ability to stay unaffected by what she deemed as other people's poor decisions. Without a word, she quickened her pace, heels tapping out a rapid rhythm as she moved toward the restaurant's heavy glass doors. As she entered, a warm wave of comfort and luxury enveloped her, the rich scent of truffle oil and fresh rosemary filling the air. She took a moment to smooth her coat and reset her composure, feeling the momentary disquiet fade as she immersed herself in the familiar environment. Seated by the window, she tried to turn her attention to the evening ahead. A table full of influential guests, potential business deals, and the unspoken competition that accompanied every gathering in her social circle. But her mind kept drifting back to the man outside. Against her will, her gaze slid toward the window, where she could still see him, his form small and hunched against the cold. He sat quietly, his expression a mix of resignation and quiet strength, as if he had expected nothing more than her rejection but still dared to hope. Lisa pushed down a flicker of guilt, telling herself that she had done the right thing. People like him were a product of their own choices, and she had learned long ago that it was better to look forward than to be weighed down by the burdens of others. She glanced away from the window, refocusing on the warm light of the restaurant, the polished wood, the quiet hum of conversation. Yet, an unsettling feeling lingered, a gnawing sense that she had left something behind, something uncomfortably close to her own carefully concealed vulnerabilities. She dismissed it with practiced ease, her face once again a mask of cold confidence. The man outside faded from her thoughts as she immersed herself in the life she had constructed, a world of success, status, and control, where there was no room for the weak or the helpless. But somewhere, buried deep beneath layers of self-imposed indifference, a small, insistent voice whispered that perhaps, for just a moment, she had glimpsed a reflection of her own humanity. The night had settled over the city, casting long shadows across the streets, and Ben pulled his worn coat tighter against the chill. As the cold seeped through the thin fabric, he remembered a time when the world had felt warm and safe. A time when he hadn't had to count every coin or wonder where his next meal would come from. His life hadn't always been this way. Once, Ben Matthews had been a man of stability, a man with dreams he had worked tirelessly to achieve. He was the kind of person people would call successful, reliable, even respected. He had a modest home with a front porch that he and his late wife, Emily, had painted pale blue. The color, she said, reminded her of hope. They had laughed, worked hard, and built a life together that felt like a gift, a precious routine of morning coffee, shared glances, and quiet, contented evenings. But life, he had learned, could be mercilessly fragile. It started with Emily's illness, a relentless disease that struck with quiet devastation. Her strength, her smile, her laughter, all slowly slipped away, leaving Ben holding onto the memory of the woman he loved more than anything in the world. The medical bills mounted, and despite his best efforts to stay afloat, his finances began to crumble under the weight of treatments, surgeries, and endless hospital stays. In those final months, Ben was by her side every day, his heart breaking as he watched her fade. When she passed, a part of him seemed to go with her. Friends and family offered condolences, words of comfort that faded into the background of his grief. And as he struggled to keep his footing, a series of unfortunate events began to unfold, each one pulling him deeper into despair. He lost his job, a position he had held for over a decade, due to downsizing. His savings dwindled to cover debts, and one by one, he sold pieces of his past. The old car they had driven to countless road trips, the small wedding ring he had slipped onto Emily's finger so many years ago, the few remnants of a life that had once been whole. When the bank finally foreclosed on his home, he was left with little more than a bag of belongings and a heart weighted with loss. The world around him seemed to shift overnight, becoming colder, harsher, as if he had been cast aside by society itself. But even as the world grew indifferent, Ben held on to something he thought he'd never lose: his dignity. He refused to let his circumstances turn him bitter, to let the streets and the countless closed doors rob him of the values he had lived by. Though he was now reduced to begging for food and shelter, he never allowed himself to forget who he was beneath the dirt and worn clothes. In the quiet moments, as he lay on a cold bench or leaned against a brick wall for warmth, Ben would close his eyes and remember Emily's voice, the way she would laugh and encourage him to find the silver lining. Even now, he tried to carry her words with him, clinging to them like a lifeline, a whisper of hope that reminded him of the man he used to be. That was why, despite the countless rejections, the empty stares, and the hard words, he never allowed himself to sink into anger. He continued to ask for help with as much humility as he could muster, hoping that maybe, one day, someone would see him as more than just a man on the streets. But the reality was harsh, and each passing day wore down his spirit just a bit more. Tonight, the encounter with the woman outside the restaurant weighed on him. He had seen the brief flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of recognition that quickly turned cold and indifferent. For a moment, he thought she might look beyond his appearance, that she might acknowledge his presence with a small gesture of kindness. But instead, she had walked away, leaving him with only the memory of her distant, dismissive gaze. He lowered his head, feeling the quiet pang of rejection settle deep within him. Yet, somewhere in his heart, he managed to hold onto a sliver of hope. Emily had always told him that life had a way of surprising you, that the darkest moments often came just before the light. As he lay down that night, his head resting on the small bundle of his belongings, he whispered her name, holding on to the belief that there was still goodness in the world, somewhere, waiting to be found. In a city that seemed to have forgotten him, Ben refused to forget the man he was. Though his life had been reduced to the barest essentials, though the world saw him as nothing more than a figure on the street, he knew he was still more than his circumstances. Somewhere, beneath the layers of hardship and loss, he was still Ben Matthews, a man with a heart that remembered love and a mind that clung to dignity, even when the world turned away. Lisa's life was a study in precision, a carefully orchestrated series of successes and accolades that had propelled her to the top of her field. She started each morning with a meticulous routine, a 5-mile run, a protein-packed breakfast, and a brief review of the markets and headlines. Her day was filled with meetings, emails, and the constant pulse of deals and negotiations that kept her one step ahead of her competitors. To those around her, Lisa Evans was the picture of control and sophistication. Her colleagues admired her ambition, her sharp mind, and the way she commanded respect with every word. But to some, especially those who saw her up close, there was something unsettling about her approach to life, something that lacked warmth or compassion. She was successful, yes, but her world was a tightly sealed fortress, one that left little room for empathy or kindness. She had taught herself to see people as assets or obstacles, categories that rarely overlapped. Her closest friends were mostly business contacts, individuals who shared her values and lifestyle, who understood that survival in their world required a certain hardness, a willingness to cast aside the weak. Today, she was meeting with Catherine, an old friend who had, at times, voiced concern over Lisa's unyielding attitude. They met at an upscale cafe with minimalist decor and a discreet clientele, a favorite spot for those who valued privacy. As they sipped their coffee, Catherine brought up the subject Lisa most wanted to avoid. "I noticed you seemed dismissive of that man outside the restaurant last night," she said gently, her gaze searching Lisa's face. Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly, a defensive reflex. "You mean the homeless man?" She waved her hand dismissively. "What did you expect me to do, Catherine? Give him money? Feed him? I'm not responsible for every person who falls on hard times. Besides, people make choices." Catherine's face softened, her voice calm but firm. "Not everyone's path is as straightforward as yours, Lisa. You don't know his story. Sometimes, a small kindness can make all the difference." Lisa stiffened, her expression cooling further. "Kindness doesn't change reality, Catherine. It doesn't make people more responsible or capable. I worked hard for everything I have, and I refuse to be weighed down by other people's mistakes." Catherine sighed, looking at her friend with a mixture of disappointment and sadness. "Not everything is black and white, Lisa. You were fortunate, yes, but luck isn't always evenly distributed. Sometimes, people need a hand to get back on their feet." Lisa felt a flare of irritation. She respected Catherine, but these conversations always left her feeling defensive, almost vulnerable. She had built a life around strength, around the belief that she alone controlled her destiny. To her, kindness was a weakness, a sentimental trap that left people vulnerable to disappointment and failure. "Maybe," she said coolly, her tone dismissive, "but in my experience, generosity is often wasted on those who don't want to help themselves." As they parted ways, Lisa couldn't help but feel a lingering irritation. Catherine's words stayed with her, a quiet echo she couldn't quite shake. She had known hardship once, but she had fought tooth and nail to escape it, and she saw no reason to look back. Her success was her armor, her protection against a world she had once feared, a world she had vowed to rise above. Back at her office, she settled into her work, her mind focusing on the numbers, the calculations, and the deals that defined her day. Each task was a reminder of her accomplishments, her power, and the life she had carved out for herself. She was proud of her resilience, proud of the unyielding resolve that had carried her to the top. But despite her best efforts, thoughts of the man from the night before lingered in the back of her mind, an unwelcome distraction she couldn't quite dismiss. She replayed the moment he had looked at her, the quiet plea in his eyes, and felt a flicker of something she couldn't name, something she had long buried. She forced herself to push the memory aside, telling herself that compassion was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her success had come at a cost, and she had paid that price willingly. The world, as far as she was concerned, was a battlefield, and those who survived were the ones who kept moving forward, unburdened by the weak. But that night, as she lay in her pristine, spacious bedroom, her mind drifted back to the conversation with Catherine. She thought about the man, about his weathered face and the dignity he seemed to hold despite his circumstances. She shook her head, scolding herself for letting her thoughts linger on a stranger, a man who was as far removed from her world as anyone could be. She closed her eyes, determined to put it behind her. Yet, somewhere in the quiet darkness, a small, persistent question began to form. A question she wasn't ready to answer, one that unsettled the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart. What if, despite all her success, there was something missing? The next morning, Ben awoke with a renewed sense of determination. The chill of the previous night had settled in his bones, but he was still here, still alive, still breathing. The sun's early rays cast a golden glow over the city streets, and he felt an almost irrational surge of hope. Today, he decided, would be different. He was tired of feeling invisible, of watching people avert their eyes as if he didn't exist. It was mid-morning when he found himself wandering near the same restaurant where he had seen the well-dressed woman the night before. He didn't know why he had returned, but something about the brief, silent exchange with her had left an impression on him. There was something in her gaze that he couldn't shake, a look that, for a fleeting moment, had made him feel seen. As he approached, he noticed her again, stepping out of a luxury car, her presence commanding attention even from a distance. He swallowed, his nerves tightening as he decided to try one more time. Perhaps, he thought, if he approached her differently, she might see him as more than just another man on the streets. Maybe, just maybe, she would understand that he wasn't asking for charity but for a chance. Summoning his courage, he stepped forward, his heart pounding as he cleared his throat to catch her attention. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite his apprehension. She paused, turning to look at him with that same cool expression, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's you again," she remarked, a note of impatience in her tone. He could tell she was already dismissing him, her gaze distant, as if she had no intention of giving him more than a passing glance. But he pressed on, determined to make his case. "I don't mean to bother you," he said carefully, choosing his words with all the dignity he could muster. I just need a chance. I'm willing to work, to do anything, really. I just need an opportunity to get back on my feet." For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or even sympathy. But then her expression hardened, her mouth curling in a faint, dismissive smile. "Work," she repeated, her tone cold and incredulous. "And what exactly could you do? Stand on the corner with a sign? I think you've already proven yourself capable of that." Her words stung, sharper than he had anticipated. He felt his stomach twist, a deep sense of shame settling over him as he absorbed the disdain in her voice. But he forced himself to stand tall, to keep his gaze steady. "Please," he continued, his voice almost pleading now. "I wasn't always like this. I had a job, a home, a life. I lost it all, but I'm trying to rebuild. I just need someone to believe in me." She let out a quiet, almost mocking laugh, folding her arms as she looked him over. "You want me to believe in you?" she asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Let me give you some advice. No one is going to save you. Life doesn't hand out second chances to people who let themselves fall this low. Maybe instead of begging, you should focus on helping yourself." Her words felt like a slap, each one cutting deeper than the last. He had expected rejection, yes, but not this level of contempt. Still, he managed to keep his composure, his voice barely above a whisper as he replied, "I didn't come here to beg, ma'am. I came here to ask for a chance. But, I understand. I'm sorry for bothering you." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his heart heavy with a sadness that felt almost unbearable. Her words echoed in his mind, each one a painful reminder of the way people saw him now, a shadow of the man he used to be. He had tried to maintain his dignity, to approach her with humility and respect, but she had stripped him of even that, leaving him feeling small, powerless, and unworthy. As Lisa watched him go, she felt a strange twinge of guilt, a small, nagging sensation that pricked at her carefully constructed armor. But she quickly pushed it aside, telling herself that she had only spoken the truth. She had no obligation to help him or anyone else who refused to help themselves. But later that evening, as she sat alone in her immaculate apartment, her mind drifted back to the encounter. She remembered the look in his eyes, a mixture of hope and despair, pride and pain, all entwined in a way that made her uncomfortable. It reminded her of something she had long buried, a part of herself she had silenced in her quest for success. Yet, even as she struggled to dismiss the thought, a quiet voice inside her whispered that perhaps she had been too harsh, too quick to judge. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself that her actions had been justified, but the memory lingered, haunting her in a way that left her feeling strangely unsettled. For Ben, the rejection was another blow, a painful reminder of the cruelty he now faced daily. But as he lay down that night, he reminded himself of the man he used to be, the man who had once faced the world with hope and resilience. He clung to that memory, vowing that he would not let the harsh words of strangers define him. Somewhere, deep in his heart, he believed that there was still a way out, still a chance to rebuild. But tonight, as the city settled into darkness, both Lisa and Ben were left with a lingering sense of unease, a quiet reminder of the fragile threads that connected their lives and the choices that had brought them to this moment. Ben awoke to a glimmer of hope on a gray, overcast morning, a rare spark that felt almost foreign to him. The night before, he had overheard talk of a temporary job at a nearby construction site. It wasn't much, a few hours of heavy lifting, hauling materials, and basic labor, but it was something. A chance, however small, to earn a bit of money, to regain a sense of purpose, however fleeting. He moved quickly, making his way to the site, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. When he arrived, he felt out of place among the crew of men, their rough hands and determined gazes a stark contrast to the tremor of doubt in his own. But he squared his shoulders, introducing himself to the foreman with as much confidence as he could muster. The foreman, a wiry man with a gruff voice, gave him a once-over, his eyes lingering on Ben's tattered clothes and worn-out shoes. After a long pause, he shrugged and handed Ben a pair of gloves. "All right," he said with a reluctant nod. "We'll see how you do. Start over there." Ben's heart lifted, and he quickly got to work. The labor was intense, the weight of the materials testing his endurance and strength. But as he lifted each load, he felt a flicker of the pride he had once known, a sense that he was, at last, doing something meaningful again. With every ache and strain, he reminded himself of Emily, of the life they had once shared, of the man he used to be. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that things could change, that he could, maybe, find his way back. But by the end of the day, his body was exhausted, the toll of the work evident in the way his hands shook, his muscles aching with fatigue. The foreman approached him, his expression neutral. "You did okay," he said, his tone neither approving nor disapproving. "But we're looking for someone with more stamina. We need consistency. I don't think this is going to work out." The words hit Ben like a physical blow, the fragile hope that had sustained him through the day suddenly slipping away. He nodded, swallowing the bitterness that rose in his throat. "I understand," he said quietly, handing back the gloves with as much dignity as he could muster. As he walked away, he felt the weight of defeat settle heavily on his shoulders. He had tried, given everything he had, only to find himself right back where he had started. Each rejection, each failure seemed to chip away at the foundation of who he was, leaving him feeling like a shadow of the man he used to be. A few blocks away, Lisa sat in the window of a trendy cafe, idly stirring her espresso as she watched the world outside. She had just wrapped up a business meeting and was scrolling through emails when her gaze lifted, drawn to a familiar figure walking down the street. It was the same man, the one she had turned away not once, but twice now. He looked different this time, more defeated, as if he had just endured another disappointment. She watched him for a moment, noting the slump in his shoulders, the exhaustion etched into his face. And as she observed him, a strange feeling stirred within her, an uncomfortable sensation she couldn't quite identify. For a fleeting moment, she felt a pang of something that almost resembled sympathy. She wondered briefly what his story was, what chain of events had led him to such a desolate state. But just as quickly, she dismissed the thought, reminding herself that she didn't know him, that his life was none of her concern. She turned her attention back to her phone, opening her calendar to review her upcoming engagements. But as she scrolled through the neatly organized entries, her mind drifted back to the man outside, to the way he had walked with a defeated, almost ghostly presence. There was something haunting about it, something that struck a chord she didn't want to acknowledge. To Lisa, failure was a concept she couldn't afford to entertain. Her life was defined by strength, by resilience, by an unyielding commitment to success. She had spent years building walls around herself, fortifying her heart against anything that might weaken her resolve. And in that moment, she told herself that this man, this stranger, was simply a reminder of the dangers of vulnerability, of the consequences that came from letting one's guard down. As Ben continued down the street, he passed by the cafe, his eyes fixed on the ground, oblivious to the gaze that followed him from behind the glass. Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line as she observed his slow, defeated walk. In her mind, he was a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of everything she had fought to escape. But even as she tried to shake off the encounter, she couldn't ignore the faint, lingering sense of unease that had settled in her chest. Somewhere deep down, beneath the layers of success and ambition, she felt the faint stirrings of an emotion she had long since buried, a small, nagging sense of empathy that left her feeling strangely vulnerable. She finished her coffee, setting the cup down with a decisive clink against the saucer. She told herself that she would forget about the man, that he was just another stranger in a city full of strangers, each with their own stories, their own failures, and their own burdens. And yet, as she left the cafe and returned to the world she had built, she couldn't shake the quiet, persistent feeling that something within her had begun to shift. For Ben, the day ended as it always did, alone, with the cold settling into his bones and the sense of defeat wrapping itself around him like a shroud. But as he lay down that night, staring up at the stars scattered across the dark sky, he made a silent promise to himself. He would keep going, keep trying, no matter how many times the world turned him away. Because in his heart, he still held onto a glimmer of hope, a belief that somehow he would find his way back. And as Lisa settled into her luxurious apartment, her mind drifting between the day's achievements and tomorrow's ambitions, she found herself thinking about him once more. In a city that valued power and success above all else, they were two strangers connected only by a fleeting glance, each one holding onto their own silent struggles, unaware of the impact their paths would soon have on each other's lives. Lisa sat alone in her spacious apartment, the city lights casting a soft glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the skyline glittered with symbols of wealth and power, each tower a testament to the drive and ambition that defined this city, and that had defined her life. Yet, tonight, her gaze was distant, her mind traveling back to memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. She had not always been the composed, immovable force that people saw today. Beneath her polished exterior was a story of struggle, one she had buried deep, determined never to look back. But tonight, despite her best efforts, memories crept in, weaving through the quiet shadows of her apartment, demanding her attention. Lisa had grown up in a small, worn-out apartment on the city's outskirts, a place far removed from the luxury she now inhabited. Her mother had worked 2 jobs, often coming home exhausted, her hands rough from endless hours of labor. Lisa could still recall the lines etched into her mother's face, each one a testament to the sacrifices she had made, her eyes holding a quiet resilience that Lisa hadn't understood until much later. For most of her childhood, life had been a series of hardships and small humiliations. She remembered watching her classmates with envy, noticing how they never had to worry about food, about bills, about the exhaustion that hung over their lives like a cloud. She remembered the shame she felt when she wore hand-me-down clothes, the awkward looks from others that silently reminded her of her place in the world. But the hardest part had been her father, a man who had once been full of promise, but whose life had slowly unraveled under the weight of unfulfilled dreams. His bitterness had seeped into their home, casting a shadow over every meal, every interaction. He had once told Lisa, in a moment of drunken honesty, that the world isn't kind to those who can't fight. That night, His words had settled into her like a stone, shaping the way she saw the world, the way she saw herself. When she was old enough, she made a promise to herself. She would never be vulnerable again, never be at the mercy of circumstances beyond her control. She would climb, claw, and fight her way out of the life she had been born into, and she would never look back. Over the years, she had done exactly that. She had studied relentlessly, working long hours, sacrificing friendships, relationships, anything that might distract her from her goals. Each achievement had been a brick in the wall she was building around herself, a shield against the weakness and vulnerability she despised. She had transformed herself into a force of power and ambition, leaving behind the girl who had once felt small, invisible, and unworthy. Yet, tonight, something about the man she had encountered, a stranger whose name she didn't even know, had reopened those old wounds. She thought about the way he had looked at her, the quiet dignity in his eyes despite his circumstances, and she felt an uncomfortable pang of recognition. His struggle, his plea, had reminded her of the life she had fought so hard to escape, a life where every day felt like a battle just to survive. For years, she had believed that success was the only path to freedom, that power was the only way to protect herself from the vulnerability that had haunted her childhood. But lately, as she sat in her empty apartment, surrounded by the trappings of a life she had worked so hard to build, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There was a loneliness in her heart, a void that her accomplishments couldn't fill. She had kept people at a distance, convinced that kindness, empathy, and compassion were weaknesses. But as the memory of the man lingered in her mind, she found herself questioning the values she had lived by for so long. Lisa rose from her seat, crossing the room to look out over the city. She could see the neighborhood she had once called home, small specks of light in the distance, reminders of a past she had tried so hard to bury. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices she had made, of the resilience she had shown even in the face of endless hardship. She thought of her father's bitterness, the way he had allowed his disappointments to consume him, and she realized, with a pang of discomfort, that she had adopted his philosophy, choosing power and control over vulnerability. In her quest to escape the pain of her past, she had become cold, indifferent, almost inhuman. She had convinced herself that success was the only thing that mattered, that compassion was a luxury she couldn't afford. But now, as she looked back on her life, she wondered if, in her attempt to protect herself, she had lost something far more valuable. The face of the man came back to her, his quiet, pleading gaze, the dignity he held on to despite his suffering. She had dismissed him as weak, as undeserving, but now she found herself questioning that judgment. Perhaps, she thought, strength wasn't just about success and power. Perhaps it was also about resilience, about the ability to keep going even when the world seemed intent on tearing you down. Lisa took a deep breath, her reflection in the window a reminder of the person she had become. She had spent years building walls, fortifying her heart against anything that might threaten her carefully constructed life. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt the faint stirrings of something else, a vulnerability she had buried, a compassion she had silenced, a small, fragile sense of empathy that reminded her of the girl she had once been. As the city lights blinked in the distance, she wondered if it was too late to change, if she had drifted too far from the person she could have been. And in that quiet moment, she felt the weight of her choices, the cost of the success she had fought so hard to achieve. For the first time in years, Lisa allowed herself to feel the full weight of her past, the pain she had carried, the fear that had driven her. And as she stood alone in her empty apartment, she realized that the walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crack, letting in the quiet, unsettling possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than the pursuit of power. Lisa arrived at the grand ballroom of the prestigious Windsor Hotel, her footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor as she approached the reception desk. Tonight was an important event, an exclusive gala hosted by one of the city's most influential corporations. Her company was in the running for a lucrative merger deal, and Lisa had been invited to meet the new CEO of their potential partner firm, a man known for his keen business sense and visionary leadership. The ballroom was a sea of black tie elegance, filled with the hum of conversation and the clink of crystal glasses. Lisa moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her expression poised, her mind focused on the night's agenda. She made polite conversation, exchanged nods with influential figures, all the while keeping an eye out for the new CEO. Rumors had circulated about him. A man who had risen to success under mysterious circumstances, someone known to be both compassionate and shrewd. After a few minutes, she noticed a small gathering at the far end of the room. The CEO had arrived, and the guests were flocking to greet him. She adjusted her posture, steeling herself with her usual confidence as she approached. But as she drew closer, her steps faltered, her heart skipping a beat as the man's face came into view. It was him, the homeless man, the man she had dismissed and ignored, whose quiet dignity had haunted her thoughts. He was standing there, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, a calm and composed expression on his face as he spoke to those around him. He looked every bit the powerful leader she had expected, yet there was something about him that was undeniably familiar. A wave of shock and disbelief washed over her, followed by a surge of shame that tightened her throat. She had assumed he was a nobody, a person beneath her notice, someone unworthy of even the smallest gesture of kindness. And yet, here he was, standing before her as a man of influence, a person who had clearly risen above the circumstances she had so quickly judged. Ben turned, his gaze sweeping over the room, and then his eyes met hers. For a moment, there was a flicker of surprise in his expression, a brief recognition that quickly faded into calm composure. But Lisa could see something else in his gaze, something that went beyond mere familiarity. There was a quiet strength, a resilience she had failed to notice before, and it filled her with a sense of discomfort she hadn't felt in years. He acknowledged her with a slight nod, a polite gesture, but there was no warmth in his expression, no trace of the man who had once pleaded for her help. She felt a pang of regret, an uncomfortable reminder of the way she had treated him, the harsh words she had spoken, the judgment she had so easily cast. Summoning her courage, she approached him, forcing a smile as she extended her hand. "Mr. Matthews, it's a pleasure to meet you." I didn't realize." Ben took her hand briefly, his expression remaining calm, unreadable. "Ms. Evans," he replied, his tone polite but distant. "Likewise." The formalities continued around them, but Lisa could feel the weight of his gaze, the quiet intensity that spoke of unspoken memories. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain herself, but the words caught in her throat, tangled by the shame that had begun to unravel within her. As the evening wore on, she found herself watching him from a distance, captivated by the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that had replaced the weary figure she had dismissed. It was as if he had transformed, not just in appearance but in spirit, as if he had found a strength that she had overlooked. Later, she found him alone near the balcony, his gaze fixed on the city lights in the distance. Summoning her courage, she walked over, her heart pounding as she approached. "Mr. Matthews," she began, her voice tentative. I wanted to say that I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I didn't know." Ben turned to her, his expression softening slightly, though his eyes held a hint of sadness. "You didn't know because you didn't ask, Ms. Evans," he replied quietly. "You looked at me and saw only what you wanted to see." Lisa's cheeks flushed, the truth of his words piercing through her defenses. "You're right," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong." For a moment, they stood in silence, the distance between them bridged by the unspoken acknowledgement of their shared humanity. Ben sighed, his gaze softening as he looked out over the city. "I lost everything, you know. My wife, my home, my sense of self. But what hurt the most was the way people looked at me, like I was invisible. Like I didn't matter." Lisa felt her throat tighten, the weight of his words settling over her like a stone. She had prided herself on her success, her strength, her independence, but now, as she stood before him, she realized that all her achievements had come at a cost she was only now beginning to understand. "I thought that by hardening myself, by focusing only on success, I could protect myself from weakness, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I see now that I was wrong. I lost sight of what really matters. Ben's gaze softened, a hint of understanding flickering in his eyes. Strength isn't about shutting people out, Ms. Evans. It's about staying true to who you are, even when the world tries to tear you down. She nodded, the truth of his words resonating deep within her. For the first time, she felt the weight of her choices, the walls she had built around herself, the emptiness that had begun to grow within her. And as she stood there, in the quiet of the night, she felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile sense that maybe, just maybe, she could change. Ben offered her a small, almost bittersweet smile. We all have our battles, Lisa. But sometimes, kindness is the only thing that keeps us going. As he turned to walk away, Lisa felt a surge of emotion, a quiet determination rising within her. She knew that this was a turning point, a moment that would change her, a chance to finally let go of the armor she had worn for so long. Ben, she called after him, her voice steady. Thank you for reminding me of what truly matters. He paused, glancing back with a nod, his expression softening into something almost forgiving. And as he walked away, disappearing into the crowd, Lisa felt a strange sense of relief, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. That night, as she returned to her apartment, she knew that her life would never be the same. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her regrets, her mistakes, her humanity. And as she looked out over the city, she whispered a quiet promise to herself, a vow to live a life filled with compassion, a life that honored the struggles of others, a life that embraced the power of kindness. The next week, Lisa reached out to Ben, requesting a meeting. She felt nervous, uncertain, but she knew that she couldn't leave things as they were. She needed to speak with him, to understand his journey, and perhaps find a path to redemption. They agreed to meet at a quiet park overlooking the river. When she arrived, Ben was already there, sitting on a bench, watching the water ripple beneath the early morning light. The air was still, filled with a peaceful silence that felt strangely comforting. Lisa approached slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of shame and anticipation. She didn't know how he would react, but she was determined to be honest, to confront the uncomfortable truths that had lingered since their last encounter. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said, taking a seat beside him. Ben nodded, his expression calm, though his gaze held a hint of curiosity. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you," he replied. "What made you reach out?" She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I needed to apologize," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "Not just for how I treated you, but for the way I've looked at people. I've spent so much of my life focused on success, on status, that I lost sight of what really matters. Meeting you, it changed me." Ben listened quietly, his expression softening as he took in her words. "You know, I didn't always have much compassion for others either," he said. "When I had my life together, I thought I understood struggle. But it wasn't until I lost everything that I truly understood what it meant to be vulnerable." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the water, as if he were reliving the memories of his past. "When my wife passed away, it felt like the ground was pulled out from under me. I lost my home, my job, everything that gave me a sense of purpose. And for the first time, I was faced with a reality I never thought I'd experience. The reality of being unseen, of feeling invisible." Lisa felt a pang of empathy, a quiet understanding that made her heart ache. She had been so quick to judge him, so certain that his life was the result of poor choices, but now she realized that she had seen only a fraction of the man he truly was. "Ben, I can't imagine what that must have been like," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine remorse. "I was wrong to judge you. I've spent my whole life trying to build a wall around myself, trying to prove that I was strong. But I see now that strength isn't about shutting people out." Ben gave a slight nod, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Strength comes in many forms, Lisa. Sometimes it's about surviving when everything is stacked against you. Sometimes it's about letting yourself be vulnerable. And sometimes it's about reaching out, even when you think no one will answer." Lisa absorbed his words, feeling them settle deep within her. For so long, she had equated strength with independence, with self-sufficiency. But now, sitting here beside him, she realized that strength could also mean connection, compassion, and kindness. "I want to change, Ben," she said, her voice steady. "I want to become someone who helps, not just someone who succeeds. I don't know where to start, but I'd like to support you in any way I can. I want to make a difference." Ben studied her, his gaze thoughtful. "That's a good place to start, Lisa. Change doesn't happen overnight. But sometimes all it takes is one small step, one act of kindness, to make a world of difference." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling between them. Lisa felt a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She was no longer the woman who had dismissed him as invisible, nor was she the person who had once prided herself on her indifference. "Ben," she said finally, "what will you do now? How can I support you in moving forward?" Ben's gaze softened, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "I've been working with a nonprofit that helps people rebuild their lives. I want to give back, to help others who have been through what I've experienced. If you're serious about making a difference, maybe you could lend your skills there." Lisa nodded, a small smile forming as she imagined the possibility. "I'd like that," she replied, feeling a newfound sense of purpose fill her heart. "And I'd also like to learn from you. About resilience, about humility. I think I have a lot to learn." Ben chuckled softly, his expression warm. "We all do, Lisa. Life has a way of teaching us, one way or another." As they stood to leave, Lisa felt a strange lightness, a feeling that she hadn't experienced in years. She had come here seeking closure, but she had found something far more valuable, a connection, a sense of purpose, and the realization that her journey was only just beginning. Ben extended his hand, a simple gesture of friendship and forgiveness. She took it, feeling a quiet gratitude settle over her, a sense that this moment would shape her in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. As they parted, Lisa knew that her life would never be the same. She had been given a second chance, not just to make amends, but to become the person she had always hoped to be. And for the first time, she felt that her strength came not from her success or her achievements, but from the courage to embrace her own vulnerability, to open her heart to others, and to find meaning in connection. Lisa returned to her apartment that evening, her mind brimming with thoughts and emotions she could barely contain. She paced the spacious living room, looking out over the city lights, feeling the weight of her past choices and the sting of regret settle over her like a heavy cloak. For years, she had focused on her own success, her own needs, without sparing a thought for the lives of others. In her quest to achieve, she had built walls so high that she'd barely noticed how isolated she had become, how far she had drifted from the girl she'd once been, the girl who had dreamed of making a difference in the world, of living a life of compassion and purpose. The conversation with Ben had shifted something inside her, cracked open the armor she had so carefully constructed. As she reflected on the man she had once ignored and judged, she realized how blind she had been to the humanity in others, how her narrow view of success had hardened her heart. Unable to sleep, Lisa took out a notebook, a blank journal she had kept in a drawer but had never used. She opened it to the first page, feeling a strange sense of vulnerability as she began to write. The words flowed easily, each line a confession, an acknowledgement of the mistakes she had made. "I don't know if I can change overnight," she wrote, "but I am ready to try. I want to see people, truly see them, beyond the roles they play or the things they own. I want to be someone who gives back, who makes amends, who reaches out with kindness rather than judgment." The pen shook slightly in her hand as she wrote, the emotions raw and overwhelming. She had spent so long defining herself by her accomplishments that she had forgotten what it meant to simply be human, to connect with others on a level that went beyond status or power. As she finished the entry, she felt a sense of release, a quiet resolve settling within her. She was ready to embrace a new path, to begin the journey of self-discovery and healing. And though the road ahead felt uncertain, she was no longer afraid of the vulnerability that came with it. Over the next few days, Lisa began to take small steps toward change. She reached out to Ben's nonprofit, offering her skills and resources to support their mission. She met with the staff, learning about the struggles and triumphs of those they served, feeling a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. With each conversation, each story she heard, she felt her heart open a little more, her compassion growing as she connected with people who had faced unimaginable challenges. She also began to reach out to those she had pushed away, reconnecting with friends and colleagues she had once dismissed. To her surprise, many of them welcomed her with open arms, glad to see a softer, more genuine side of the woman they had once known. One evening, as she was leaving the nonprofit office, she spotted Ben in the lobby, talking with a group of volunteers. His face lit up as he laughed, a warmth in his expression that spoke of resilience, of a strength forged through hardship. She approached him, feeling a rush of gratitude for the role he had played in her transformation. "Ben," she said, her voice filled with sincerity, "I can't thank you enough. Meeting you, it's changed my life. I finally see what I was missing, and I'm trying every day to be better, to make a difference." Ben smiled, nodding as he looked at her with a sense of understanding. "Change isn't easy, Lisa. It takes time, but you're doing the work. That's what matters." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them. Lisa felt a sense of peace, a quiet knowing that she was on the right path. She was no longer defined by her accomplishments, her status, or the walls she had built around herself. She was defined by her heart, by the connections she was now making, by the kindness she was learning to extend to others and to herself. As she walked home that night, she felt lighter, unburdened by the fears and insecurities that had once held her captive. She was ready to embrace her humanity, to live a life that honored the dignity and resilience of others, to find strength in compassion rather than control. For the first time in her life, Lisa felt free. Free to be vulnerable, free to connect, free to live a life that truly mattered. The following month was a season of new beginnings for Lisa. Each day, she immersed herself in the work of the nonprofit, finding joy and meaning in helping others and in slowly reshaping her life. She started hosting workshops for people who were working to rebuild their lives, using her expertise to guide them in crafting resumes, developing interview skills, and building their confidence. For the first time, her knowledge and success were tools for empowering others, not just for advancing her own career. One afternoon, she and Ben were meeting with a group of young adults at the nonprofit, talking to them about resilience, courage, and the power of community. As she listened to Ben share his story, she was struck by how his journey had transformed him, how he had taken his pain and turned it into something beautiful, something that could inspire and uplift others. When the meeting ended, she pulled him aside, a smile playing on her lips. "You know, Ben," she said, her voice warm, "you're a natural leader. I don't think I've ever met someone who speaks with so much heart." He chuckled, shaking his head. "If you had told me that a year ago, I wouldn't have believed you," he replied. "Back then, I was barely holding on, just trying to survive. I never thought I'd find a way back, let alone a purpose." They shared a quiet moment, both reflecting on the unlikely path that had brought them together. Lisa felt a swell of gratitude, a deep appreciation for the journey that had led her here, to this place of connection and renewal. "Thank you, Ben," she said softly, "for everything, for giving me a chance to change, to see the world through a new lens. I don't know where I'd be if we hadn't crossed paths." Ben looked at her, his gaze steady, filled with warmth and understanding. "Lisa, you've done the work. You chose to see things differently, to embrace compassion over judgment. That's not easy. And I have a feeling you're only getting started." They decided to organize a community event, a fundraiser to support the nonprofit's mission. Together, they poured their energy into planning it, inviting community leaders, local businesses, and individuals who had been impacted by the organization's work. For Lisa, it was an opportunity to give back, to connect with the people she had once overlooked. She was learning, day by day, to embrace a life defined not by wealth or status, but by purpose and kindness. The evening of the event arrived, and the room was filled with people from all walks of life, benefactors, volunteers, and individuals who had been helped by the nonprofit. As the program began, Lisa stood at the front of the room, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. She scanned the crowd and caught Ben's encouraging smile, giving her the confidence she needed to speak from her heart. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady. "I'm humbled to be a part of this incredible organization, one that has changed my life in ways I never could have imagined." She paused, feeling the weight of her journey, the lessons she had learned, and the walls she had torn down. "For years, I focused solely on success, on building a life that looked perfect from the outside. But in doing so, I lost sight of what truly matters: the people around us, the connections we make, the kindness we show. This organization, and the people I've met here, have taught me that true strength comes from compassion, from lifting each other up, and from seeing the humanity in every person." Her words were met with a round of applause, and as she stepped down, she felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond anything she had ever known. Ben joined her, a quiet pride in his eyes as he clapped her on the shoulder. "You've come a long way, Lisa," he said, his tone filled with admiration. "This is just the beginning." The event was a success, raising enough funds to expand the nonprofit services to reach more people who needed support. But beyond the financial achievement, it was a night of healing, of forgiveness, and of newfound purpose for Lisa and Ben. As the evening wound down, Lisa and Ben walked together outside, the cool night air wrapping around them. They were both quiet, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, on the unlikely friendship that had blossomed between them. "Ben," Lisa said, breaking the silence, "I'm grateful for you. I didn't know it then, but meeting you was the turning point I needed." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "And I'm grateful for you, Lisa. You reminded me that people can change, that they can find their way back to their own humanity, even when they've lost their way." They stood there, side by side, two souls who had once been strangers, but were now bonded by shared resilience, by the journey of forgiveness and renewal. Lisa knew that she had been given a second chance, a new purpose, and a friend who had helped her discover the strength that lay within compassion. As they parted ways that night, Lisa felt a profound peace, a quiet joy that came from knowing she was living a life that truly mattered. She had found her way, not through success or ambition, but through connection, through kindness, through the courage to change. And as she looked back one last time, watching Ben's figure disappear into the night, she whispered a silent promise: to honor the journey, to live a life of compassion, and to be a light for others, just as he had been for her.